Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I'm finishing up my three-part ranking of every Hercule Poirot novel written by Agatha Christie. This video contains my top 10 Poirot novels, each of which is a spectacular entry into the world of detective fiction. These top 10 were extraordinarily difficult for me to rank, and all of them bounced around quite a bit. Ultimately, it came down to the very fine details. Fair warning, there are spoilers ahead, and major ones at that, since what makes these books so great is often the big reveal at the end. Starting off at number 10, I placed a novel that features one of Christie's finest dives into psychology, and that is Cards on the Table. This novel is one of the ones where Christie challenges herself. She limits herself to just four suspects, and these four people have all allegedly killed before and gotten away with it. The four suspects play bridge while their host, Mr. Shaitana, watches from his armchair. Shaitana is stabbed to death, and the killer must have murdered him right in front of the other three. Poirot and his three fellow detectives, Colonel Race, Superintendent Battle, and Ariane Oliver, and an all-star cast of characters, work together to solve this brazen crime. The most fascinating aspect of this novel is the way Poirot analyzes the four suspects' personalities from the way they play bridge and applies this knowledge to the murder. He knows Mrs. Lorimer is too calculating to pull off a daring murder, and Anne Meredith is simply too accident prone to attempt it and get away with it. It has to be the bald Dr. Roberts because he plays bridge in a very risky manner. He takes chances, and that is ultimately what does him in. This psychological aspect is this novel's main selling point, and Christie accomplishes her challenge very well. She limits herself to just four suspects, which I believe is the fewest amount of suspects she uses in any traditional mystery novel, with absolutely no padding. This is a less is more type of novel. Now, I know some people have problems with this book's focus on bridge. It does help to know the game, but it is not a requirement. I don't know how to play bridge, and I followed along just fine. Everything you need to know is explained without heavy, tedious explanations. The reason why I don't have cards on the table higher is because it lacks a little bit of the shock factor that the other novels have about it. Where those nine novel solutions really hit you over the head with a hammer, Cards on the Table solution is merely one of the known four possibilities from the start. For that reason, I have Cards on the Table here at number 10. Now, for number 9, I have the final appearance of Hercule Poirot and the last novel published before Christie's death, and that is Curtain. Now, I don't think Curtain is anyone's favorite Poirot novel, and for good reason. It's not a particularly fun novel. I don't mean that it slogs or anything like that, because it doesn't, but the themes are very dark and the material is heavy. It's full of nostalgia, with Poirot and Hastings reunited where it all began at Styles. They are both old men now, but the relationship is still the same. Poirot, now confined to a wheelchair, needs Hastings to be his eyes, ears, and legs to hunt down a murderer. In true Poirot fashion, he doesn't tell Hastings the whole truth, specifically that the person they are looking for, whom he calls X, does not kill people, but rather plants the seeds of murder in the minds of others and watches as they commit murder. The tricks Christie plays in this book are marvelous. X is such a ruthless murderer that he not only convinces Hastings to attempt a murder, but he convinces Poirot to actually commit one. And that goes to show just how much evil there is in the world and how powerful it can be. In many ways, Curtain exemplifies what the mystery genre is all about. When the natural peace of the world is disturbed, a hero comes in to save the day, and order and peace is restored. Curtain is the ultimate culmination of 50 years of Christie novels with that theme. Even beyond all of this, the mystery plot is wonderful as well. We have Hastings being his typical lovable idiot self, and he is constantly ruining Poirot's plans as well as the murderers. Christie continues to play with our assumptions as well. After Barbara Franklin dies, everyone believes it to be a suicide, but Poirot thinks it's murder. Yet, when he takes the stand and answers the questions at the inquest in such a way as to get her death declared a suicide, the assumption the reader makes is that Poirot is lying, but no, he's actually telling the truth about what he saw, specifically that Barbara Franklin stole poison from her husband's lab. Then we have Hastings playing around with the spinning bookcase, which gets the wrong person killed in his typical dodo self. This book has some of Christie's best character work. Poirot and Hastings' friendship is so realistically portrayed here. They love each other, yet they have bitter arguments and fight and distrust each other at times. And all of this plays into the murder plots. Judith Hastings is a top one-time Christie character. I love her independence and how she interacts with her father when he butts into her private life. She isn't anything Hastings thinks she is, yet she lets her father continue believing these things to teach him a lesson, and that's really fun. The shadowy figure of X is a remarkable villain, an all-time great, and of course, Poirot's death scene is a very emotional one that still gets me every time I read it, even though I know it's coming and I know exactly what happens. Curtin is a fitting end to the career of the world's greatest detective, Hercule Poirot, but is not his best case, so I put it here at number 9. At number 8, I have a big novel, and I'm going to be honest, I think this novel is overrated and perhaps too high on this list, and that is Murder on the Orient Express. And I know this is a beloved Christie novel, and I agree. I am in no way saying this book doesn't deserve its status as one of the best detective novels of all time. It does, and I love this book a lot. But I disagree with the tendency of people to state that this is the best Agatha Christie novel of all time. Murder on the Orient Express has been adapted, parodied, and imitated countless times, and that alone makes it a classic. The twist in this book that everyone did it is not only genius, but also reused by so many authors and filmmakers since this book was published. And this is the best example of that twist because it feels so natural, and you can feel all of these characters' grief and indignation over the miscarriage of justice. You can feel Poirot's dilemma of whether or not to let the passengers go or turn them over to the police. The emotion of this book is what is so great about it. However, I find the center portion of this book to be a slog to get through. Once the train is stopped and Poirot begins his interrogation of the characters, the narrative slows down considerably. I don't like long series of interviews with suspect after suspect. There is a lot of telling in this book as well, and that doesn't make it the most interesting read, especially when you already know the solution. I also don't think the big reveal that everyone did is as shocking as it could have been, because it's stated that many of the passengers on the Orient Express are connected to Daisy Armstrong in some way, and there's no way a dozen random people on some train have the same connection without it being done on purpose. I do think Murder on the Orient Express is one of the greatest mysteries of all time, but I don't think it is at the very top of the Poirot list. This could be because it's been adapted to death that I feel overwhelmed by it, but I also think there are 7 better Poirot novels than this one, so I have it here at number 8. Now, for number 7, I have a Poirot novel that I see being held in higher regards more and more often, and that is The ABC Murders. And The ABC Murders is very much like Three Act Tragedy, where one person wants to commit one murder and hides that murder amongst a series of seemingly unrelated murders. Only this book is superior in every way. The murderer creates this serial killer persona who murders victims alphabetically: Alice Asher in Andover, Betty Barnard in Bexel, and Carmichael Clark in Churston. In terms of in universe, this is the largest plot in a traditional Christie murder mystery. It's a nationwide hunt for a serial killer, but in true Christie fashion, the murderer's motivation is a personal one. There is no serial killer. There is no threat to the larger public. There is no insane person going around murdering people. This is a Christie novel where you should know better than to think it's actually going to be a serial killer. Yeah, the reader will fall into the same trap, as always. Poirot is at the top of his game here. In this novel, more than any, I think his skills of detection are on display. He is constantly sussing people out, carrying out plans of action, and using his little gray cells. There are so many wonderful clues in this book, such as the sea letter going astray and Hastings mentioning that it seems like it was delayed on purpose. If I have one criticism of this book, it is that I never really bought the framing of Alexander Bonaparte Cust. It seems a little too obvious he was being framed. However, this is an outstanding novel and one that feels a little different than your typical Christie mystery, and for those reasons, I have the ABC Murder here at number 7. Now, the next 4 novels on this list are ones that are lesser known hidden gems. They aren't the big name novels that get all the attention, but they deserve their positions at the top of this list. At number 6, I have Five Little Pigs, and I think this novel has some of Christie's best character work. The entire mystery is character. This is the best example of the murder in the past novels that Christie visits from time to time. Every single major character in this book is extremely well drawn and very well incorporated into the mystery. Ammius Crail and his wife Caroline Crail don't appear in the flesh in this book, yet it feels like we know them as if we've met them in real life. The 5 suspects, or little pigs, are extremely dynamic characters as well. The answer to the murder is hidden within those 5 suspects and the 2 victims, so we need to know them well, and Christie draws them so expertly. They all have these little nuances in their personalities, such as Cecilia Williams appreciating cheap art and Angela Warren playing tricks on Amyas, and many of these nuances feature prominently into the solution of the mystery. Christie challenges herself in Five Little Pigs. She limits herself to just five suspects, or six if you include Caroline. Not only that, she is challenging herself in the writing style and plotting of this book. We hear the events leading up to Amyas's murder no less than 12 times. We hear it twice from each of the pigs and at least twice from the legal people at the beginning of the book. Yet, this novel has almost no repetition. Every time we hear this story, we are presented with new information or are given a different perspective on events. The way Poirot is able to solve this crime by analyzing what each person highlights in their narratives and what they leave out and how they interpret certain things is absolutely genius. And Christie does all of this by showing us these events, not by telling us these things, which would have been the easy, boring way to tell this story. The reason why I don't have it higher on the list is because I think the murder itself is pretty generic. That's not a complaint because I think the murder plot in this book fits in so well with the characters. It doesn't need a big, complicated murder. I love the idea of a painter spending his last moments on Earth painting his lover who murdered him as he slowly comes to this conclusion, and this revelation is shown in the eyes of Elsa Greer in that painting. Five Little Pigs is a fantastic mystery novel. It's one of the best of all time, but on a list of spectacular Poirot novels, it only comes in here at number 6. Now, for number 5 is my personal favorite Poirot novel, but when I'm judging these books fairly, I can recognize this is not the best Poirot, and that is Hercule Poirot's Christmas. What makes this book my favorite is the solution. This is the one where the police inspector did it, and Christie pulls this off very well, where Superintendent Sugden is not one of these corrupt police officers the hero has to bring down that we see so often nowadays. He is an ordinary police officer with a very personal motive. He is drawn not in the most dynamic way, but there is a specific reason for that. All of these one off inspector characters are typically pretty generic. They are in the novel because they have to be, and they may have one or two small personality traits that make them human. Sugden is the same way. He enters the novel just as the inspector normally does. He has a few personality traits like how handsome he is and how he strokes his jaw with his finger and throws back his head and laughs. The difference is these things are stated repeatedly, and Christie does such a good job of trying to get us to notice a character we don't normally pay attention to, and yet the reader's focus is still likely to be on the Lee family proper. This is a rare locked room mystery from Christie and one that has a brilliant yet simple solution. It is not overly convoluted, which is always better for these kinds of stories to maintain credibility. The clues in this book are wonderful. I love the moment when Pilar says her grandfather was very handsome as a young man, just like Superintendent Sugden is now. Sugden blushes, and we think it's because he's embarrassed that a pretty woman just called him handsome, but in reality, he's embarrassed that Pilar just exposed him as Simeon Lee's son. Like in all of these top ranked Poirots, Christie expertly uses the psychology of her victim in the murder beautifully. There is so much focus on what kind of person Simeon Lee is. We are repeatedly told that Simeon Lee was an unfaithful husband and how he joked about having better sons somewhere else in the world. Christie repeatedly drives home these points, and yet, because of Sugden's status as the inspector, we are still focusing on the immediate Lee family. It works so well. The reason why I don't have this novel higher on the list is because there is some unnecessary bits at the end, such as finding out Pilar isn't really Pilar, and then there's a bit of uncomfortableness regarding Harry Lee and Stephen Farr, who fall in love with Pilar even when they think she is their niece. It's a little strange, but it does not mar an otherwise fantastic mystery novel that I have here at number 5. At number 4, I have a novel whose mystery plot functions in a very similar way to Hercule Poirot's Christmas, and that is another personal favorite of mine, After the Funeral. This book also features a large estranged family, and the murderer is an outsider who plays off of the family's suspicions of each other to avoid detection. In general, I would say the characters and the murder plot are better in After the Funeral. This is the highest ranked Poirot involving an impersonation, and it's one of the best and most believable impersonations in a Christie book. Miss Gilchrist dresses up as her employer, Cora Lansquenet, to attend the funeral of Cora's brother, Richard Abernathy. It's here she drops the bombshell that Richard was murdered, and this is one of my favorite twists in a Christie novel, where we learn that Richard actually died naturally and was not murdered. This is a Christie novel, and we've trained our brains to be suspicious of every death in a Christie book, so to find out there's a natural death is quite the shock. Much of the novel focuses on which Abernathy could have murdered Richard, and hardly anyone is looking into the actual murder of Cora. And the most obvious suspect in her murder is the person who lives with her, Miss Gilchrist. And Christie really provides us with a lot of great clues to hint at this. We are told so many times that something was off about Cora at the funeral, and how no one has seen Cora for 25 years. I think the clue about how Cora always painted from life, yet she allegedly recently painted a dock that was blown up in the war, is another fantastic clue. As I've said in previous videos, I love Christie's stories set in the aftermath of World War II. After the funeral utilizes this setting to the fullest. Rationing is still in effect and taxation is high, and both of these things are mentioned a lot in this book. The rationing in particular is important because it's responsible for Miss Gilchrist losing her beloved tea shop we hear about time and time again. One aspect the setting has on the plot that I appreciate is that Miss Gilchrist is so desperate for money, she kills Cora for a painting that's worth barely anything. It really shows how dire the situation is and how miserable Miss Gilchrist is, who is a stand in for the working class during this time. She is quite possibly my favorite Christie murderer. I love how she is described as this dainty companion who does none of the rough housework, yet she slays Cora brutally with a hatchet, disfiguring her face. Poirot calls this a very ladylike murder. And Timothy Abernathy is another great character. I love how terrible he is. He's one of the invalids that's not really an invalid, and everyone knows it. He comes off as unlikable, which is a bit of a change than these characters are usually depicted. Sometimes Christie writes these characters as if they are wise, but she spares Timothy no sympathy. What keeps this book out of the top three is that it could use more Poirot. It's not that Poirot is barely in it, but he doesn't come in until later than usual. He has some great moments, like when he pretends to be Monsieur Pontellier, and Rosamond just immediately exposes him to absolutely no fanfare. But the lack of Poirot means After the Funeral comes in here at number 4. At number three is the final one of these unsung novels, although I think this one is a little more well known, and that is Peril at End House. This is the first time Christie uses the trick of the seeming victim was actually the murderer the whole time, and it could be because this is the first time she uses this, and she uses it a lot, but this is the novel where it works the best. Nick Buckley is this sweet, innocent young woman who is just full of this deep seated evil and ruthlessness. It really comes out of nowhere, and when that mask comes off, it is spectacular. I love the way she not only uses Poirot to convince him her life is in danger, but she also lures him into it, so it's his idea that she is in danger. It's magnificent. I also love when Christie writes an absolutely cutthroat killer like Nick Buckley. The reader is never really suspicious of her and always believes her life is in danger. Christie litters this novel with some of my favorite clues in any of her novels. She uses a lot of name and wordplay in this book. Nick and her victim, her cousin Maggie, both have the full name Magdala Buckley, and Nick uses this to her advantage, where she is able to seize upon Maggie's fiance, leaving everything to Magdala Buckley. And since no one knows Maggie was engaged, Nick can easily seize upon this. My favorite clue is when Nick shares Captain Seaton's love letters with Poirot, but she has removed the ones that mention the name Maggie. And there's one written just days after Nick had a major surgery, but there's no mention of this surgery or well wishes. This book is truly a delight from start to finish and is one of Christie's best, if not her simplest. Now, I actually do have more knocks for Peril at End House than I have for the last few novels I talked about, but I think the positives are also greater, which is why it is above those titles. I do think there's a lot more coincidences in this book, such as Maggie's engagement being secretive and Maggie wanting to go back inside during the fireworks for a coat. I'm also not a fan of this subplot involving the Crofts stealing Nick's will, but their downfall is an all time great scene where Poirot fakes Nick's death and they hold a seance for her. That's all a lot of fun. So I have Peril at End House here at number 3. Now, for the top two, and these two were pretty much definitive for me from the start, although this next book was at one point a little lower on the list, but at number 2, I have Death on the Nile. And this is yet another Christie classic. This is her longest novel, I believe, but doesn't feel it. We have a very long setup where we meet almost every character and we get a bit of insight into them. This book has a lot of characters, and each one is at least somewhat developed. None are duds, and every one of them fits into the murder plot seamlessly. Christie puts in so much effort to explain why all of these people who hate Lynette are on this cruise on the Nile, rather than just leave it up to coincidence that all of these people are somehow together. Poirot is fantastic in this book. We really see his trademark matchmaking skills here, where he sets up both Rosalie and Tim and Cornelia and Dr. Bessner. His skills of deduction are really top notch here as well, where he doesn't ever really get distracted by the murderers. Although he is stumped at points, he does make the logical conclusions at every turn. Simon and Jackie are some of my favorite killers in a Christie novel. I know this book is criticized for the unrealistic and convoluted murder plot, which I disagree with. I think it's this murder plot that makes the book so believable. Absolutely no intelligent person would attempt to pull off this ridiculous murder scheme, but Simon and Jackie are idiots. Jackie even says the only reason why she gets involved in the first place is because she knows Simon is too stupid to get away with it on his own. They bite off way more than they can chew. Typically in mystery novels, the plot has a lot of moving parts and everything goes swimmingly for the murderer, but here everything goes wrong for them. Louise sees Simon running around the ship after he's supposed to have been shot, so Jackie has to kill her. Then Mrs. Otterburn sees Jackie exiting Louise's cabin after she's killed her, so they have to kill her as well. It's really laughable how bad they are at it, and it fits their personalities perfectly. The chef's kiss of all of this is earlier in the novel when someone else tries to kill Lynette and Simon saves her for some reason. It's just hilarious. Death on the Nile has a great setting, and Christie is able to capture Egypt on the page without going into long, flowery prose and turning this book into a travelogue. The characters and the mystery plot come together to form one of the best mystery novels of all time, so I have Death on the Nile here at number 2. And now for the top spot, and this one was pretty easy to select, although I did have it as low as number 3 at one point, but then I came to my senses and put it at number 1, and that is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And if you have not read this novel, I recommend not listening any further because you do not want this spoiled. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was one of the most controversial and most discussed mystery novels when it was published. Christie pulls off her greatest twist in this book, and that is that the narrator did it. And this was such a shock at the time, and people were offended and claimed that Christie didn't play fair here. She broke one of the cardinal rules of mystery fiction. But my favorite thing about this book is that she didn't do any of these things. She absolutely plays fair. The narrator, Dr. Shepard, never lies to us. He does withhold some information, but even then, it's not a lot or that important to solving the mystery. I always have fun rereading this book, knowing the solution, and trying to find a place where Christie slips up, but she never does. There's a great scene where Shepard recalls seeing Ralph Patton talking to Mrs. Ferrars shortly before her suicide, and the reader interprets this as Ralph Patton must be her blackmailer, but in reality, what's going on is that Shepard is wondering if Mrs. Ferrars has told Ralph Patton that he is her blackmailer. This book is full of scenes like that. Poirot is such a humorous presence in this book. I love his retiring to grow vegetable marrows and absolutely failing at it. He gets angry and throws the marrows into Shepard's backyard. It's peak Poirot, and his skills of detection are wonderful as always. This book feels very traditional. We have so many popular tropes like a broken relationship and gritty relatives and deception with a dictaphone, which is pretty revolutionary for the time. We have Poirot following a lot of physical clues, which isn't really his forte, but it gives this novel a Sherlock Holmes-esque quality to it. And of course, Caroline Shepard is an all-time great character. She's allegedly the prototype for Miss Marple, and one that's really one of the best one-time Christie characters. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is the greatest mystery solved by the world's greatest detective. The trick of the narrator being the culprit has been used by hundreds of future authors, and none of them have pulled it off anywhere as near as excellent as Christie does here. It would be a sin to put The Murder of Roger Ackroyd anywhere else but here at number 1. And that is the conclusion of my ranking of every Poirot novel. Next week, I will continue ranking novels by the Queen of Crime with her other books. I decided to combine all of the non Poirot and non Marple books into one list. So that list will have the standalones, the Tommy and Tuppence books, the Superintendent Battle novels, and many more. So until next time, Mystery Files.